I'm going to present a proof of concept analysis for the airport, where we took sort of some of the nascent data that David's been producing that's available in that carbon map and beyond on their website, on sort of like how one might go about mapping different transparency levels to those carbon factors as a proof of concept. Big asterisk though, right? This is all the raw data. As David mentioned, there's a technical committee moving forward trying to understand how to QA/QC this data or make recommendations around the data methodology. So this should be viewed only purely as a proof of concept of what could come down the pipe, depending upon what happens in that committee. The other thing that I think that these types of proof of concepts look into is, how big of a deal is this, right? When we just look at the carbon data in the forest, like the SFI tool, that map, we get a relative difference of carbon stocks in the forest. But what does that mean for a building that has a net zero embodied carbon goal, right? How much of it can it potentially offset or make an impact in terms of the level of mass timber structure? So those are the things that, I'm going to try to dig into with this, as I mentioned, proof of study. In terms of the forest factors, we're still sort of rolling along pretty slowly with that. It's still just a custom input right now, which we'll talk about in a second. We're currently being incubated by the Carbon Leadership Forum's incubation program, and we've been just understanding sort of use cases and getting some stakeholder feedback around that case, as sort of the research continues to move forward. So that's sort of where we're at currently, and let me talk a little bit about how it can be used right now. So it's funny, I was putting this together, last night, and I was just screenshotting all of the input modules for the tool and put it all in this one slide. I'm like, 2.5 years, like this is all I have to show, right? These 27 green boxes for inputs to like spit out all the data. Although it's nice too that it's pretty streamlined. This is a full model, right? All within the spreadsheet, full cradle to grave, even getting into some other types of aspects around comparative LCA. But this is still the forestry module, right? Right now, we just have the custom data source is the only dropdown that we have, and you have to input in kilograms of CO2 per meters cubed of industrial roundwood value that then gets applied to the input volume of wood for the system, and all the conversions take place. But the question is like, what the hell do you put in this box? And like I said before, probably nothing at this point, right? But as sort of this research becomes more available, this will be pretty flexible, and we have some decisions to make down the road if we try to streamline certain factors that are coming out of different research groups, or we just sort of keep it custom and do all the post-processing outside the tool and funnel in the tool. There's lots of decisions we'll have to make in the near-term future, but proof of concept time. PDX Airport is what I'm going to use as the background. I'm going to go through this really quickly because I think probably most folks have seen this, and what's not important isn't the details of the project, it's just how we used it to do these calculations. So, this is a giant project, we're renovating it. It's heavily massed timber, there's a massed plywood roof, there's a lattice timber, linear ceiling, and there's like 2 million board feet of 2x8 lamb stock glulam. So this is what we analyzed for the carbon footprint analysis. This is what it looks like. We have this concept of forest to frame, trying to get at those transparency issues that Brad had set up really well right before this. And this could be its own hour-long presentation, but we've developed at least 6 pathways from this one project of how we might get to forest of origin, which includes segregation, like Brad mentioned, or just simple mill log purchasing disclosure. How those work with these carbon factors is something that we're really interested in terms of what is the relationship to level of transparency versus the kind of data that's coming out of these different research efforts around upstream forest carbon. For another time then. Where we ended up was here in terms of, this is just for the glulams and for the lattice, in terms of how much do we have no segregation or data tracking. We're relying on FSC credit origins to get to a county level landowner type forest factor, versus where do we have segregation, where do we have a little bit of both, right? This sort of forms the blueprint of what's available for us in terms of what carbon factors do these potentially apply to. And of course, the roof, I think this month, was it July, is starting to get chopped up now and moved over the existing building, so everyone's super excited. And then this is where we get into the LCA questions, right? Is that, this is the structured envelope, whole building LCA, cradle to gate. We use tally for this analysis. And I've disaggregated the roof versus everything else in the building. So this is actually a terrible example to look at mass timber analysis, because it's just like a bespoke roof on a giant airport project. We really should be looking at like the PA Living Building, right? One of these sort of prototypical, mostly mass timber structure buildings, but it is what it is. And so we've got broken within this, the roof and the beams, deck, and ceiling, which are the things that we had swapped out. And we can see that with sort of typical analysis, once we look at going to the mass timber roof, we get a little bit of savings, 6%. This is without biogenic storage, right? This is just the EPDs with end-of-life factors and the fact that wood is just generally less carbon intensive than our steel was an open joist counterpart. We double that roughly when we look at the biogenic storage in the product with end-of-life assumptions using the tally model. And then the big question for us is like, what about all the sustainable forestry? What can we claim based upon the transparency approach or the certification approach that we had taken? We also looked at it just broken down into the roof itself. So this is whole building scope, and then this is just looking at the assembly. And then we'll switch back and forth as we move forward. And this is just how those numbers shake out when you look at just the straight up production emissions and end of life versus with biogenic storage, flipping it negative, whether in Athena or Tally. This is usually the pattern that we see once we include biogenic storage. So how low can we go, basically? And as we started to think about the way that the data exists around the factors, there's sort of these three different levers that we can push and pull. There's the landowner types that the data exists from, although as David mentions, depending upon the state, it's reported slightly differently. There's the spatial scale, whether we're looking down at the landowner, county shed, the entire state, or a region of the state, or the entire state. This data exists at multiple different scales, and the level of uncertainty kind of changes depending upon where we're looking. And then there's three different time periods and aggregated time periods. There's like different averages or rolling averages. There's a lot of different ways to deal with the statistical analysis that also makes a big difference in this case. So, these are just three different aspects, but they provide a lot of complexity in terms of how do we map that back to our wood procurement package. So this is an example of, based upon the product and the level of disclosure that we have, right, where did we land in terms of that factor scale? So where we didn't have forest of origin, but we had disclosure through the FSC credits, we were able to get the FSC credit origin and locate it back to the county by landowner type. So we're at we're at this scale of that process. Where we have segregation, we can get down to the same level, right? We could have landowner specific, but the data doesn't necessarily exist for specific landowners at this point. It may not, it depends on how things shake out down the road. But where we have that segregated data, we can do something similar. And so we had that for the glulam, we had it for some of the lattice. And then for the mass plywood, we really only had the state medians. So and this data sort of changed back and forth depending upon what we were able to get. But at first, when we didn't know any information, we tried to make some assumptions about regional county shed. And then at some point, we got disclosure data where we can look at landowner by county. So, we actually have looked at it in multiple different versions. But this is just an example of how these different factors map different levels of transparency. And then here's sort of the first blush at like, well, how much of a factor is this? And, these should have error bars on them, right? But this is just the median. And so as we sort of march through this, right, we also included some of the early simulated forest factors, which I believe that we talked about in this call in this group before, in terms of a 50-50 Oregon-Washington split and sort of what impact that would have versus this more observational satellite-based approach. And there's a big difference, right? And there's a big variability behind both of these different additional claims of savings. But the question of like, how much of a deal does this make starts to become clear. And, David has said it multiple times, like the upstream impacts can sometimes dwarf the downstream impacts. And so the question is how much, depending upon these assumptions of where you're at in those distributions, and then how much of the overall carbon footprint does this start to touch on as well. So, from even just going to biogenic storage with the simulated factors, we see a certain, 25-ish% increase. But once we go to this particular package, based upon our procurement breakdown, we see a pretty huge jump in terms of how much that upstream package was starting to sequester. And it's interesting because we look at all of those different factors, we relate them back to those pieces, and it tells a really interesting story. Even going back to what David was saying about, tribal lands. Some cases they're, reducing carbon stocks because they're in dry side forests. They're doing really good climate resilient work. It's getting penalized by this particular, approach that we did to the proof of concept, but we still ended up with the net sequestering package because of the diversity of sourcing that we did across all of those different products. So, this is just interesting that I think that our approach of diversifying intentionally and including, tribes from all the different regions, different states, ended up helping us out, right? If we would have just sourced from one or the other, we could have gotten into this weird way to try to justify that. But the diversity in this case was helpful because, these factors are very different depending upon the state, county, and landowner breakdown. And then so when we zoom back out, the whole building LCA, this is sort of where things landed, right? It was an additional 3% savings with the simulated factors, and then it was a pretty substantial 25% increase, all the way up to a potentially 40% reduction when we look at the observed factors. And I just sort of marked where the lead credit maxes out at, just to sort of show that even a 3% difference is significant, I would argue, as we're talking about point credit thresholds, because it's we don't really know what percentage of reduction is good, bad, aggressive, not aggressive. But the fact that it's this amount, should make us all say that okay, this does make a difference. And the variability behind it is actually also good in that our procurement decisions and the intentionality of that, we know makes a difference as well. If all these data distributions were super tiny and it's well, it doesn't really matter what I did, I'm always going to end up here, it wouldn't matter. But these are huge distributions, right? So what we do choose and how we start to be intentional about that does make a difference. So that's my optimistic characterization of data variability. So as we're moving forward, this is a very simplified version of a very complicated diagram of really what are those different pathways of transparency and procurement, and then sort of what different types of carbon factors could you use based upon the early eco-trust research. So depending upon if you have certification, you could go straight to certification factors like the stuff that I think Brad's producing, or maybe SFI will eventually. If you have the origin, you could get into these different scales of the satellite data versus all these other different levels of transparency. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and cut it so we have plenty of time for questions. And that was indeed the last slide. So that's where we're at currently, which is a fun place.
Thank you, Jake. And thank you to all of our speakers. I think that